If you would open your Bibles to the prophet Malachi, very end of the Old Testament there, one of the last things that God said through his prophets. We want to look at a statement that is made there and build our lesson from that point. So glad you're here this morning. It's been great for us to already reacquaint ourselves with some people that we knew before when we were here a long time ago. But when we're here, grateful for that, to meet some new people. All of that has been a blessing. And I can tell you from a preacher's standpoint, and I'm sure Ryan could tell you the same thing as any preacher could, we don't take for granted what it means to have this extended family. And to be able to meet this extended family as preachers, we get a chance to meet a lot of brothers and sisters that not everybody gets that same chance. And we're grateful for that. You truly are family with us. I hope you will perceive us to be with you. We are children of God, brothers and sisters together, and grateful for that. If you're visiting with this congregation, really glad you're here today as well. I wouldn't know probably if you're visiting, so if you want to tell me that afterwards, that would be good. But I don't know the congregation as a whole, since I am also visiting, coming in from the San Antonio area of Texas. In Malachi's prophecy, he's faulting the nation of Israel for several things. And they had so perverted their worship and their service to God that he eventually gets to a point where he says, you know what, it'd be better off if somebody just shut the doors. I want you to think about how bad do things have to get before you have a prophet of God saying somebody just needs to shut the doors to the house of worship, because what you're offering to God is not at all what he's looking for. And they are questioning continually, what have we done? How is it not acceptable to the Lord? And he faults them for several things. Faults them for bringing sacrifices to offer God that they wouldn't dare offer to anybody else. He says they're blemished, they're not your best, you're offering second best. That doesn't work. But in particular, as he addresses them, he says there's a second thing that they do, starting in verse 13 of chapter 2. And he says, and this second thing you do, you cover the Lord's altar with tears and weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. And you say, why does he not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. That's an interesting comment. And I think that's interesting to us because it's not a concept that we are necessarily intimately familiar with. But he says that this wife of yours is your wife of or by a covenant. And what exactly does that mean? I'd invite you to turn back to Genesis chapter 15, because there is a covenant ceremony that is described in chapter 15. And as you think about this covenant ceremony that is going on between, at this time, God and Abram, I think we're going to see that there are some similarities that exist between this covenant, or the concept of covenant, and even the covenant of marriage, and why that is so important. Starting in chapter 15, read with me if you would, starting with we'll pick up in verse 7. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. But when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So I just want you to get the picture in your mind first. This is going to be a covenant that God enters into with Abram. He's going to make some promises, which is really the concept of a covenant. He's going to make some promises to Abram. Abram's not entering this covenant at this point. Abram's covenant and the sign of his covenant is going to come a couple chapters later, when Abram and then the rest of the Israelite males after that are circumcised as a sign of their promises to God. God is making a promise to Abram. That's the question. How am I going to know, God, that I'm truly going to get this land. God says, I'll make a covenant with you. I'll promise you in that covenant. So he says, bring these animals. But I just want you to get, again, the picture of that, the visual that goes along with that. That he says, bring me a cow, bring me these other animals, and we're going to cut them in half. And that was cut in half this way, like head to tail for them. Cut an animal in half. And it says, and he laid the two halves opposite each other. I understand, that's a pretty gruesome picture. That's not typical in our culture. We don't think of those kinds of things. We're not a culture that thinks in terms of animal sacrifices in general like they did. I remember I worked in Tarpon Springs, Florida for several years, which is a highly Greek community. And at the time of their Greek Epiphany, they would sacrifice lambs in the street. I had never seen that before. I didn't grow up on a farm. I didn't think about those kinds of sacrifices. There were no lambs on the street the day before. But all of a sudden, there were lambs everywhere, and they were being sacrificed, which means they literally cut the throats of the lambs on the streets. And it's an ugly sight. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just not pretty to see. Neither would it have been that take two halves of a cow and a ram and a goat and lay these things beside each other, opposite sides. I understand that's a gruesome thought, and I'm not trying to just give you the gruesome thought. I want to make a point out of that. Because the concept of a covenant was that it was tied by blood to the promise. And so if there was a covenant that was made between, say, two nations or two people, they would do that kind of thing. You're cutting these animals in half in a blood covenant. And the people that were making the covenant with each other, the agreement with each other, would remove their sandals or shoes or whatever. They would walk between the paths of the animals. When they came out on the other side, you can imagine now what they look like, their feet. They are covered in the blood from the animals, which was intentional. And when they came out to the other side, they could look at the blood on their feet, and the concept was, may I pay with my own blood if I violate this covenant that we make today. That was the whole concept. Now, God says that she is your wife in Malachi, your wife by covenant. I don't think that necessarily means that they went through a blood covenant ceremony for every marriage ceremony, but the concept is the same. And I'm not beginning to suggest, if you're not married yet, this would not be my suggestion for your ceremony. And if you choose this, I'd prefer you find somebody else for sure to marry you. That, to us, that sounds just purely gruesome. But it had a point. I would ask you this. If you had gone through a ceremony like that, whether for marriage or anything else, and came out on the other side, do you think you could ever forget the ceremony? I'm thinking that's emblazoned now. That's never leaving my mind. I would always have that in my mind. People will occasionally ask me things about, did you have this at your wedding? It's 46 years ago. I'm just telling you, it was an incredibly precious day. I loved it that day with all my heart. There are still things about it now I have forgotten and don't remember. I understand that. But had I walked through that path of animals, I'm confident I could tell everybody still, no, let me tell you about the blood and how the blood on our feet and what we had to wash off. And that part would stick. That was the intent of it. It was to absolutely stick in their minds. And so what I want to do is I want to look at 4 similarities that exist between the idea of marriage and the covenant agreement that would have been taken in any other circumstance. Think about even this particular covenant that God entered into with Abram. He is going to give Abram a land, a home. There's an inheritance for the children of this covenant, like there would be with a marriage. Abram's going to have a name change, like we have name changes associated with a marriage ceremony. Abram was Abram, he's going to become Abraham. There was an exchange of things. In 17, Abraham is going to be circumcised, but in this particular case, God is giving Abraham gifts similar to the way that we do. Here's my question. We have an incredible problem in this country, and probably worldwide, but in this country for sure, of rampant divorce and marriages that are severed. Some statistics say as many as half of marriages end in divorce. How many of you in here, and I'm not asking for a show of hands, please, but how many of you in here know somebody, and even know somebody that is a Christian who has gone through this tragedy of divorce? I would say most every one of us knows somebody that has gone through that. We're not immune to that concept and that influence in the world. My true belief is that we deal with the backside of that question a lot, divorce and remarriage, and I'll get to something on that in a minute. But I truly believe we would have to deal with that way less than we do if we could get this part of the equation right to start with. If we would understand what commitment we have made, what covenant we have entered into. If we truly grasped that, then we would have to deal with the backside of that equation, what happens for the severance, much less than we do. Does that make sense? All right, so think about it. I think Christianity is the same way. I think it's important to let people know who are going to become Christians. You know what? I wish I could preach to you a health and wealth kind of gospel and everything's going to go great if you come to Christ, but I'm not doing that because that's not true. Sometimes Christianity is tough. And in our culture, we're finding out it's coming tough pretty quick. Things that we used to be persecuted for, we are not too far off in the distant probably from being prosecuted for. Things that we may teach, things that we may say. We understand. It's not always easy. And so when I always think about, what if we use Joshua's evangelistic tool? Remember when Joshua was talking to the people? He makes that great speech, and we'll look at that on Wednesday night, part of that speech. But don't you love the fact that when Joshua says, you know, you can choose who you're going to serve. He makes that choice. And he talks about, but it's for me and my house. And you remember what the people said? The people said, we're with you, Joshua. We will serve the Lord with you. And Joshua said what? Great, that is what I was hoping you'd say. No, Joshua said, you can't do it. I always thought, what if I was trying to teach somebody the gospel and they said, oh, you know what, I want to serve Christ. How comfortable I would be saying to them, I don't think you can do it. But that's what Joshua did. He wasn't trying to dissuade them. He was trying to get them to understand what level of commitment was being asked for. The same as when we come to Jesus Christ. It isn't a matter of, you know, I'm coming to Christ. We need to understand that's a commitment for your life, for all that you do. Marriage is a commitment for life, and that's the idea. He's saying you need to understand this nature of this. And so just 4 similarities that we want to look at in this particular idea of covenant marriage. And as we mentioned in the last lesson, you want to know how your kids are going to know that it works? How God's plan is right? How God's plan is just? Then you be faithful to the promises you made. You do what God has asked you to do in that relationship. First, marriage and covenants are both vows that are taken before God. The whole idea, we just read Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 21 to 23, and God says things like, you made this promise, so you live up to it. He says, you voluntarily made this promise, so you live up to it. Nobody made you make this promise. I assume I am talking to a group wherein there were no shotgun weddings. I'm just assuming that. If yours was a shotgun wedding, then I understand you might have had to make the promise. No, we voluntarily. I chose to marry my wife. I chose to go through that ceremony. I chose to take her as my wife for a life that was intended to be for as long as we both shall live. God says, you voluntarily made that. You think about that. When I start a wedding ceremony, I always say something like, dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the presence of God and these witnesses. God was there. Recently, for those that know the name Adam Levine, you know, this morning I used a reference that lost the younger half of the group. That may be lost on a whole older half of the group. Adam Levine, singer, lead of Maroon 5, went to some weddings They crashed him, he and his band. And they played at the weddings. The bride and the groom didn't even know they were coming. They got with one person involved with the wedding to set it up, but nobody else knew they were coming. They just kind of went, no charge at all. I thought, so imagine you're one of those young people and Adam Levine performed at your wedding and somebody said, hey, who was at your wedding? And you're thinking, Adam Levine was at my wedding. Realize how incredible that would be to some people? I mean, this guy of star magnitude was there. You know who was there? God. God was at your wedding. There was nobody at your wedding more influential, more important than God. When Eisenhower was president of this country, he used to worship at a local, I don't even know what denomination, but a local group in D.C. whenever he was in town. And people knew that. And so sometimes people would go because they would hope to be able to see the president in the worship service. Somebody called that particular group on one occasion, and the preacher was describing the conversation, and they asked him, he said, we're going to be in D.C. this weekend. Is Mr. Eisenhower going to be worshiping with you? I love the preacher's response. The preacher said, we're not sure when Mr. Eisenhower will be here, but we are relatively certain God will be. I just thought, I like that answer. Whether I would agree with him necessarily or not, that's beside the point. But that's the same as right here, is it not? Who is the most important person here today? God is the most important person here today. He is here. Jesus Christ says, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of you. He's not just watching, he says, I'm there. Ceremonies and covenants are taken before God. But not only God, they are taken before witnesses. There's a reason for that. You remember Jesus teaching on the importance of witnesses. He says, you have a problem with a brother, and this is a whole lesson in itself. You have a problem with a brother, he says, who should you talk to? Go talk to the brother you have the problem with. Now, I'm just saying we could just divert, if we had time, and do an entire lesson based on that because we struggle with that. Sometimes we want to talk to everybody but the brother we have the problem with. But he says, go talk to him. You might be able to make it right, and nobody even has to know there's a problem. But he says, if he won't listen to you and you don't make it right, what's he tell you to do? Take 2 or 3 witnesses, because witnesses help verify the truth. That's always been the case. If it's a he said, she said kind of argument, nobody can solve that because nobody else was there. So he says, take 2 or 3 witnesses with you that you can establish the truthfulness of it. And that's the nature of this. I read an article several years ago that I thought was just great because at one point in Russia, the best man would pay a fine if the marriage didn't last at least a certain duration. It's like, wow, that's an interesting concept. So somebody comes up to you and says, hey, will you be best man at my wedding? I don't know. Let's talk about how serious you are. You planning on sticking with this? You're gonna continue to live with her in faithfulness? And yeah, that's tough. How many people in here had a register at their wedding, where people sign? Interesting, because we've got the concept backwards. That's not the way it started. Everybody signs as they go in, don't they? You go in, you sign the register. We're at the wedding. Originally, that was set up as a registry of witnesses. And so, in other words, people as they came out signed it. In other words, they were saying, I was here, I witnessed you take that vow. That's what they were saying. So you had a bunch of people said, I witnessed you taking that vow. That would make me think more seriously about signing the register too, because that makes me one of the people that needs to help hold them accountable. When Judy and I got married, she grew up, as I mentioned this morning, I wasn't a Christian, didn't grow up in a home of Christians. And not only that, I was pretty anti-Christian in behavior prior to coming to Christ. And there were people that Judy knew that I knew that after I met her, that knew that was my past life. So there were some people that were pretty concerned about her choice in husband. And they were concerned because they didn't know what my commitment level and my background and all that stuff was. And we're at our wedding reception, and I'm trying to change my life. I'm now committed to Christ. I've been baptized for a couple of years, trying to serve the Lord. And I don't know how many people in here know Melvin Curry, but Judy grew up with his kids. He was a professor at Florida College when I was there. And he's not a very big guy. I mean, I don't know what Brother Curry is. He's probably 5'8", maybe 5'9". But he's intimidating. I can tell you that. Used to be a Gold Gloves boxer. That didn't help my view of how safe I was around him. But he came up to me at my wedding reception and said, tap me on the shoulder. I was talking to somebody. He tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around and he goes, did you hear what you said? In that kind of tone of voice. I'm telling you, I was trembling. And I thought, I'm looking at the person, and I know I used to use language I shouldn't use. I was trying to break those kind of habits. I'm thinking, surely I didn't use curse words at my own reception. I wasn't using that kind of foul language, was I? And I'm playing all this conversation through my mind, and I said, I'm sorry, Brother Curry, I don't understand. He just looked at me again. He said, did you hear what you said? So I'm playing it again. I thought, well, I used to talk about people and didn't care about gossip, so I might have been talking about somebody. Was I talking about somebody I shouldn't have been talking about? What was I doing? I did not understand. I could not recall. And so I said, I am sorry, Brother Curry. He says, I mean, when you were standing up front and the preacher was asking you those questions, did you hear what you said? He said, because I did. And I will hold you accountable for them. That's 46 years ago. I'm still looking over my shoulder. No, he was just making a point. He was just saying, look, you made promises, and part of my job is to help hold you accountable for the promises you made. I appreciate that. I appreciate that there are brethren that will say, I'm going to help hold you responsible. So think about that next time you're at a wedding. Part of your role, be there, be entertained, enjoy it, have a good time, all of that. But part of your role at being invited to a wedding is you are a witness of the vows that are taken, and you should help hold those couples accountable for the vows that they have taken. Better or worse are the vows we take generally. I loved, one preacher said to the husband to be, do you take this woman for better or worse? For richer or poorer, sickness and in health? The man said, yes, no, yes, no, no, yes. It isn't 6 different questions. It is, am I willing to commit my life to them? Thirdly, covenants are serious, and they're only used on serious occasions. That's why he refers to a wife as a covenant wife. People didn't make a covenant. If we were living in those times, I wouldn't have said, you know what, go get a heifer and a goat and a ram because I want to buy that coat you got for sale. No, if I was buying a coat, I'd give you the money, you'd give me the coat, we're done. That covenants were made when nations were agreeing not to go to war with one another. When there were large transactions of some type. They were life-changing or altering situations. The kind of idea of Ruth, when even though that's not a marriage issue at all, you remember Ruth's conversation with Naomi when she is saying, because she's told, go back to your own people. Don't follow me. Remember what she said? She said, no, I'm going with you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. That's the seriousness of the nature of marriage. We are marrying somebody with an absolute, complete agreement to meld into we are one, as God has described. It's serious. Covenants are serious. Marriage is serious. And then finally, they don't come with an escape mechanism. They're never intended to be that. People today talk about things like marriage contracts. Marriage is not a contract. And I'll tell you the biggest difference between a contract and a covenant, the biggest difference Contracts are based on mistrust. Covenants are based on trust. That's a huge difference. People sign contracts so they have a piece of legal paper that they can require the other person to do what they said they will do. You remember back in the day when people talk about a handshake was good enough? Handshake isn't good enough in most places now. Go to the bank and say, I'd like to buy this house. Yeah, I agree to pay it. They're going to have you sign a book of papers to verify that you owe that money. That's the nature of a contract. And typically, a good crackerjack lawyer can find a loophole in a contract. There is no loophole in a covenant because it is a promise made. Unconditionally, it is a promise made. God didn't say, Abram, you're going to get this land if. He said, no, I promise to give you this land. Now later, he tells Abram, you're only going to keep this land if. But he promised he'd give him the land, period. That's the nature of a covenant. It has no built-in escape mechanism because God didn't intend that it be an escaped from situation. When you signed for a house, if you've ever bought a house, there was one piece of paper, I can tell you that as a Christian, there was one piece of paper more important than anything else you put your name on. There's one piece of paper in that stack that is called a promissory note. You sign deeds and all kinds of other stuff and mortgages probably and all kinds of stuff. But a promissory note was just you saying, I promise to pay this loan off or back. You made that promise. And I'm telling you as a Christian, they could take all the rest of the papers and set them aside, and it shouldn't matter. Because if I said I'll do it, then I should do it. And that's what God tells me. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. There is no built-in escape mechanism. Don't get me wrong. God provides a means. He doesn't intend. He joined them together. He said, let not man separate till death do us part. 5 words that were in our ceremony that were in a lot of other ceremonies. That's what God intended. Now, Jesus did say that he would allow a person to be put away because they committed infidelity to that covenant. Because they committed adultery. And he says that in Matthew chapter 19. Anyone who puts away his spouse except for the cause of adultery and marries another commits adultery. But God, because he understands the treachery involved in adultery, is why he even allows that. You can go back to Malachi. God doesn't like it. God says he hates divorce. It's still the breaking of a covenant, but the one who broke it was the one who committed the adultery. Well, one of the things that's more prevalent that I've had to deal with recently, and I'll just tell you where I stand on this, because of all the couples I deal with couples that have a lot of different issues, and I have been asked, what about Matthew chapter 5? Because Jesus says, the one who lusts after a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so I get asked regularly, is that what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 19? Does that give you the right to put your spouse away, whether husband or wife, and remarry? I would tell you need to look at the language and the things that Jesus says, because the adultery has not been committed there except in the heart. The same as the brother who hates has already committed murder in his heart. But he's not guilty of murder and cannot be charged with murder. Jesus is talking about heart issues that lead to actual issues. And Jesus is trying to help them understand you can't just guard against the action. You have to get your heart right or it's going to lead to the action. Coveting is just like stealing. But it isn't stealing. But he's saying, you know what? The person who covets is very likely to take something that isn't theirs. Why? Because their heart is wrong. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' point is your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. They understood the law concept. They never had the heart right. He says you've got to have a heart that is pure. You need to purify your heart. You have a problem with something like pornography, he says, then you better clean your heart up and your actions to go with that. You need to do that. Whatever is necessary to do that. Seek whatever help is necessary. But I don't think that Jesus is saying in that passage, based on the concept of every one of those, look at all the things he talks about. Whether you love your neighbor or you don't, all of those different things. He's making heart points and telling them they need to take a different approach to the idea of religion, because if your heart's not right, the actions won't be right either. Adultery is a cause for divorce. Lusting is like they have committed adultery, but not that they have committed adultery. Hatred is like murder, but it's not murder. I think he repeats that same concept through each of those steps that he's talking about. Now, I can tell you that's a prevalent problem. We could do a whole lesson or more on just the concept. The couples I deal with, it is becoming rampant in marital problems. There's no question about that. We need to do what we can to help anybody, brothers or sisters, that are caught up in that life. Because if their heart's wrong, I dealt with 7 couples at one time, 5 of which involved heavy pornography. 3 of those resulted in adulterous relationships. I think that's exactly what Jesus says is happening. You let the heart go wrong, the actions are going to follow. But it's the actions that he says permit for the putting away, not the heart issues. We need to correct the heart. And if you're not a Christian, that's the first thing you need to do. Make a covenant with God. He's already promised you. He's promised every one of us that we can have eternal salvation because Jesus died for us. Am I willing to commit back to him? God, I give you my life because of what your son did for me. If you've never been baptized into Christ and you understand that's what you need to do, we'd love to help you take care of that today. If you don't understand that, talk to me, talk to one of the others here about what God says is necessary to establish that relationship with him. And if we can help you do that in any way, let us know while we stand and while we sing.